Good evening, fellow Orami members and guests. Shabbat Shalom and welcome. My name is Rachel Levy, and my husband, Cedar, our children, and I live in the town of Ashland and have been members of Orami since about 2012, I believe, so almost 10 years. My children have gone through religious school here. My sons, Liam and Caleb, were bar mitzvahed here and now are part of Orami Temple Youth. And my daughter, Amelie, was supposed to be bat mitzvahed last summer, but of course, then we were hit by the pandemic, and she's in the 8th grade and 14 years old. I have taught in the religious school here, and I have served on the education committee, and I'm now on the board of directors. In my other life, I am a teacher and an activist with a PhD in education in leadership and policy. I'm a member of the Hanover Democratic Committee, Together Hanover, and of the Hanover NAACP. I have been a PTA president, a team parent for my boys' high school soccer team. I've served on several committees of the school districts where I live and work, and I'm currently the president of my local education association. I'm here this evening to talk about my Jewish background and values and how they have influenced me as an activist and now as a candidate for the Virginia House of Delegates in the 55th District. First, let me tell you about my background. I grew up in Washington, D.C., the daughter of 2 civil rights lawyers. I am the youngest by 2 years of 2 daughters. My sister, Dina Levy, and I are almost exactly 2 years apart, and we both went to D.C. public schools all the way through. My sister now lives in Weehawken, New Jersey. My mother grew up in the city of Chicago, and when she was about 12, moved out to the suburbs, and my father grew up in Brooklyn, New York. They met in graduate school at the University of Michigan. My father was in law school, and my mother was getting her PhD in linguistics. This came in handy because although she later switched careers and became a lawyer also, she helped tutor me when I needed it in Hebrew school. My paternal grandparents did not talk much about their parents being from Russia or Lithuania. In fact, it wasn't until I was almost 10 years old that I was even conscious of what countries their families had come from. They talked about being Jewish, and they talked about being American. When my mother started to show an interest in going to Russia, she unwinds by reading Russian literature in the evenings in its original language. My grandmother paused and looked at me and said, "What does she want to go there for?" So being Jewish was central to their identity. And in fact, I took it for granted that I had a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, and that was uncontroversial. But I later learned that my grandmother was very upset by my parents' engagement and said she wasn't going to go. My grandmother was a very strong woman, and I think she was just primed to be rejected by non-Jewish people. I think that's where that was coming from. She had only a 9th grade education, and my grandfather only had a high school education, but she was very sharp. And when you met her, you knew she was in charge. She did not defer to people. She was the real politician in the family, and she lived to 100. That's where I get my energy from. And you had to pick your battles with my grandmother. And so my grandfather picked his, and they went to the wedding. And my grandmother's fears were not borne out. My mother's mother, my other grandmother, arranged to have a rabbi marry my parents, which was a wonderful gesture. And think about it, my mother's parents were most definitely WASPs, but they raised my mother to be the kind of person who knew she could marry a second-generation American Jew with a strong Brooklyn accent without it being questionable. And so the rabbi told my parents that he would marry them under one condition. They had to raise their children Jewish. My mother took this to heart, while my father didn't take it as seriously. At least that's what they tell me. While we observed Jewish holidays, my parents and my father did not force me to go to services or to go to Hebrew school. I did choose to go a few times with him, especially to high holiday services. And I went with my childhood friend Susanna one Sunday. I had slept over at her house, and we went to Hebrew school, at her Hebrew school the next day. And then I think I said to my dad, well, why don't I go to Hebrew school? I'd like to do that. And so I started going when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I didn't look back. I went to Temple Sinai in DC, and I think that kind of rekindled my father's, I'm not sure he was a member at that point, but he became a member. I went on to have my bat mitzvah there, and he's still a member there. And so, just as my father did not force me to go deeper with my Jewish identity, Judaism does not force you. In fact, it's a lot of work to be Jewish. We hear a lot about the chosen people, but the way I see it, you really have to choose to be Jewish, especially in this country in most places. In fact, at the time, before my bat mitzvah, the rule was still that your mother had to be Jewish for you to be considered Jewish. And so the rabbi really wanted me to go and have a conversion ceremony at the mikveh. And to be honest, I resented it. And I probably could have kept questioning it and debating it. And I'm pretty sure, I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I'm pretty sure my father went in and said, do we have to do this? And because he knew I wasn't too pleased about it. And maybe he wasn't either, for all I know. But I think he was told not that I had to do it, but that it would be unusual if I didn't. And so I did it. I do what I have to do when something is important to me. And both of my parents came, and we went out to celebrate with dim sum after. And my mother kept remarking how happy the rabbis were. And that gave her a lot of pleasure. And in my synagogue, where I felt like I belonged, we sometimes talked about making justice a priority. And living in Washington, D.C., we sometimes went to marches and talked about what was going on near the government. And so as an activist, I've really carried with me this same sense of persevering and doing the work to be part of a community, to embrace a set of beliefs and values, and to act on them, to live them. But also, I said Judaism doesn't force you. It's really not a conformist religion. Judaism is democratic, and that is epitomized by how Judaism treats the concept of God. First of all, God in Judaism is not a dictator, and you cannot use God to justify fatalism or justify doing whatever you want, nor do Jews say that God made them do things or that things are going well or not just because it's God's plan. God does not run your life, you do. God just gives you the tools to navigate that life. And it's a religion where people have agency, and where agency is central to realizing your full humanity. And when people are enslaved or do not have justice in other ways or do not have the power that they should, that is a denial of their agency. And that is inherently against what the Judaism I know teaches. And that is central to my work as an activist and as a representative, that if some people in my community or in my district don't have justice, don't have full agency, don't have their humanity fully acknowledged, then I don't have justice and no one has justice. Then all the agency of all of us is endangered. Because yes, in theory, in this country, in Virginia, we have a democracy, but there is not full democracy for everyone. And that's part of what motivates me in my work as a teacher, as an activist, as a candidate, and as a representative, is to do the work of fully realizing democracy for everybody. And so I observe, I analyze, and I question how power is distributed and exercised. And internally, so does Judaism, constantly. And both of my parents taught me to interrogate power, especially when there are imbalances. And if you are strong or privileged or advantaged or possess a disproportionate share of power, then according to the Judaism I know, you are obligated to use your strength, to use your privilege, and use your advantages to help the vulnerable and the powerless. And you should be giving of what you have so that you don't have more power than you should. This brings together the idea of agency and tikkun olam, that human beings are responsible for completing God's creation and improving the world. I cannot fulfill my role as a good Jew without helping others when I can, and without making the world a better place, or at least trying to. And that's why I run, to make people's lives better, no matter who they are or how they vote. So I spoke earlier of Judaism being democratic. Judaism is also pluralistic. And I'll return again to the concept of God, in that there is no one way in Judaism to think of or perceive of God. In fact, a Jew might not even believe in God. In fact, you are supposed to, as a Jew, question the existence of God. You are supposed to grapple with what God is and what God isn't. You are supposed to argue with other Jewish people about God. And so it's not disrespectful in Judaism to question God's existence or even to get angry with God. For me, God is not a being, but life itself. The air we breathe, the water we drink and swim in, the trees that grow, the children that we might choose to give birth to or raise. But that's personal. The focus collectively in the Judaism I know is on how you act, not on what you believe, which is good because I am a person of action, and I believe to make change, you must take action and not just talk. And as an activist, I got to the point where I felt like I reached the limits of productive action. And in that realm I was in. And so I decided that I officially wanted to serve the public, to act in their interest. And this same tradition of pluralism within Judaism has influenced me as an activism and as a public servant, because we also don't have to all think the same way in a democracy, and we can debate and disagree, and it's not personal. Questioning and debating how we're governed, just as questioning and debating how we worship, is engagement, and it shows you care and that you're interested. That's how I perceive patriotism as well. A good Jew questions and is skeptical and takes action in the interest of living a more moral life, and a patriot is someone who cares enough to question and debate what's best for their community as a whole, and who shows up and contributes and tries to make their community a better place. The last thing I want to talk about is more cultural. And that's the idea that there aren't a lot of Jewish people in the world, and so it's special. It's really special to be Jewish. I think it is, and I am proud. I am proud to be Jewish. But it can be lonely. At the same time, it teaches me to not be afraid. Even growing up knowing and learning about the Holocaust, and knowing that people have been killed just for being Jewish. But to still be who I am and not pretend I am someone else. And I live in a place where there are more conservative people than I am. And sometimes I've been the only progressive-leaning person or the only Democrat in the room in a local school board meeting or a board of supervisors meeting. Or I've been the only person to stand up and say, raise my taxes so that we can have enough money to fund our schools and to fund services that members of the public need. And it gives me insight into what it feels like to be in the minority, something that is important for a white person. And for those two things, I have carried with me as I have launched this campaign, and that's to be proud of the values I stand for and not pretend otherwise, but also to be respectful of what it's like to not be in the dominant group, to not be known or seen the way that those in the dominant group are, to not have the power you should, and to have my finger on the pulse of that and to listen to those people. And hopefully, if I work hard and am lucky, make legislation that will help them. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.